Welcome back to another Diablo 4 build guide. In this video I'll be going over the best build to level from 1 to 50, then how to properly transition your build into the endgame once unlocking World Tier 3. I will also be breaking down my current gear and the must-have aspects that put your DPS over the top. Make sure to stick around until the end of this video so you don't miss out on any crucial information. Also, if you enjoyed this build guide, make sure to leave a like on this video and subscribe to the channel to stay up to date with the best builds in Diablo 4. With that being said, let's get straight into the video. The leveling build is going to have completely different skills compared to the endgame build, which we'll be discussing later on in this video. The leveling build is going to focus more on AoE damage, survivability, and strong single target DPS, so you're able to kill all bosses for your playthrough of the campaign. For your basic skill, you'll be using Puncture, which is a throwing blades attack which damage enemies at a short distance. The animation for this skill is extremely smooth, fluid, and has the best modifier out of the 4 basic attacks that you have to choose from. Fundamental Puncture is extremely important for the rogue because if you hit at least 2 of the 3 blades at once, it'll make the enemy vulnerable for 2 seconds. This will make them take 20% more damage from you. This also synergizes extremely well with the items that you can find along your journey through Sanctuary. For your core skill, and arguably the most important skill for this build, is Twisting Blades. This impales an enemy, doing initial damage and making them take 8% increased damage from you while impaled. Then 1.5 seconds later, the blades return to you doing even more damage. Then 1.5 seconds later, the blades return to you doing even more damage than the initial impale. Because this skill has no cooldown, you can mix this with the rogue's Inner Sight specialization for some insane burst damage and great AoE clear. The Inner Sight specialization gives you unlimited resource for 4 seconds. Once the gauge reaches full, allowing you to spam Twisting Blades as much as possible until the 4 seconds is up. You'll want to spec into Advanced Twisting Blades as this is extremely useful even after the extreme nerfs it has received. Before moving on, I want to talk about a super important codex of power that you can get early on. That aspect is going to be the BladeDancer Aspect. This aspect makes Twisting Blades orbit around you for a short time, dealing 10% of the Twisting Blades return damage, and based on the distance it travels, it can potentially increase it up to 20% of the return damage. I highly recommend that you rush to the Jala's Vigil dungeon in Ska's Glen, as this aspect not only increases your DPS substantially, it also gives the rogue some insane AoE potential as well. The third skill you'll be using is Dash, which is going to help you get around the battlefield with ease. Best used to enter the fight, dish out a ton of DPS, and dash out before getting into immediate danger. For this skill, I only spec into the Enhanced Dash, as I feel the third tree in this skill is pretty lackluster. For your fourth skill, you'll be wanting to use Concealment. What this is going to do, it's going to allow you to vanish from sight, gaining stealth for 4 seconds, and will not be removed by taking damage. This also grants Unstoppable, which can negate any CC effect you are currently undergoing. This skill is extremely useful because the majority of your deaths, if you die at all, will be due to the CC that the enemies in Diablo 4 have. Make sure that you spec into Countering Stealth, which will make the skill used to break out of stealth become a guaranteed critical strike. This also allows you to use this skill offensively as well as defensively. For your fifth skill, you're going to want to run Shadow Imbuement. This skill is by far the most enjoyable skill that the rogue has. You imbue your weapon with Festering Shadows, and your next 2 skills deal shadow damage and infect enemies for 6 seconds. Enemies will explode on death, dealing 40% of the damage to all surrounding enemies. You mix this with your Twisting Blades and BladeDancer Aspect, you can easily apply the shadow stack to every enemy you are fighting with ease. This is going to give you some insane clear times against big groups of mobs. Also, you're going to want to spec into the Blended Shadow Imbuement, which will make enemies vulnerable from the explosion for 2 seconds, which will grant you 20% increased damage to those enemies. You're also going to want to make sure to have the passive Consuming Shadows to generate more energy so you can use your abilities more frequently. For your ultimate skill, you're going to use Shadow Clone, which will have a clone mimic your actions for 15 seconds, dealing 60% of your damage. This is solely used to burst down elite monsters with high HP, as well as bosses. Because you have Shadow Imbuement, you don't need any more AoE, so we're going to be using this skill slot to focus on single target DPS. As for your key passives, I recommend taking Close Quarters, Damaging Enemy with a Marksman skill, which in your build is your basic attack, or a Cutthroat skill, which will be Twisting Blades. This will grant 10% attack speed bonus for 8 seconds. While both attack speed bonuses are active, you'll deal 20% increased damage against crowd control enemies. There isn't really many good options for your leveling build, so this is going to be the best one for you. Let's talk about when to begin your transition into the endgame build. I highly recommend transitioning into Poison Twisting Blades once you find a gear piece with the offensive aspect of Bursting Venoms. This aspect is critically strikes with poison immune skills have a 10% chance to create a toxic pool that deals, in my case, 3,731 poison damage over 3 seconds to enemies within the pool. Your poison imbuement skill has no cooldown and no charge limit while standing in this pool. This is absolutely insane when you mix this with your poison imbuement, Twisting Blades, and your Inner Sight specialization. With this combo, I have managed to reach over 100,000 poison damage in each second to bosses within Diablo 4. Once you find this important gear slot is exactly when I would begin to make that transition into your endgame build. As for your skills, you'll be keeping Puncture, twisting blades, and the dash skill, exactly the same from the leveling guide. For your 4th skill, you'll want to use Poison Trap, spec into countering Poison Trap, giving you 30% chance to reset your Poison Imbuement skill. This will give you more opportunities to proc the Bursting Venoms aspect, ultimately giving you greater opportunities for insane DPS. Poison Traps not only increases your poisoning damage output, but it also knocks down enemies to activate it for 1.7 seconds. This is extremely useful as they can't damage you if they are CC'd. Next skill will be Poison Imbuement, which will imbue your weapon with lethal poison, making your next 2 skills deal poison damage, dealing 204% of their base damage as additional poisoning damage over 6 seconds. Just a heads up, the percentages will vary as I have modifiers within my build. Also, make sure to spec into Blended Poison Imbuement. This will have critical strikes with poisoned and imbued skills to have a 75% increased poisoning damage. For some important passives, I would get Deadly Venom, which deals 9% increased poisoning damage, and Debilitating Toxin, which will make poisoned enemies deal 15% less damage to you. Now for your ultimate skill, if you're playing with friends and you have someone with great AoE, I would highly recommend keeping Shadow Clone. You can mix this with the aspect Imitated Imbuement, which will allow your Shadow Clone to also mimic imbuements applied to your skills. This throws your single target DPS over the top, and you'll absolutely be melting any boss you come in contact with. If you're playing solo, I highly recommend using the Death Trap ultimate skill. This will provide for CC, amazing AoE damage, and help you burst down mobs within the higher world tiers. Also, this skill has built-in cooldown reduction, allowing you to use it a lot more frequently rather than the Shadow Clone. For your key passives, you want to change that into Exposure passive. Dealing direct damage to an enemy affected by a trap skill has a 25% chance to reduce the active cooldowns of your trap skills by 20%. This is amazing as more traps equal more opportunity to reset your poison imbuement. This will ultimately allow you to have more opportunities to proc that bursting venom aspects. For the full skills and passives, see the build link in the video description down below. Now let's do a deep dive into my gear and what other aspects synergizes extremely well with this build, and what stats you need to be looking out for. My helmet is absolutely amazing, giving me bonuses to Dexterity, Intelligence, and the +3 ranks to my Poison Imbuement skill. Dexterity increases your skill damage and dodge chance. Intelligence increases your crit chance and resistance to all elements. And 3 ranks into my main skill is absolutely nuts for my DPS. For my aspect, when hit while not healthy, which is under 80% health, a magical bubble is summoned around me, and players in the bubble are immune. This occurs every 90 seconds. This is an extremely great defensive aspect, as you can solely focus on dishing out as much DPS as possible with no fear of dying until the bubble begins to fade. My chest piece is really good, giving me poison damage, dexterity, intelligence, and ultimate skill damage. For the aspect, we have another defensive one, giving me basic skill grants 20% damage reduction for 2 seconds. Survivability is going to be key for the rogue, as you're going to be extremely squishy throughout your playthrough. You can't deal damage from the grave, so you're going to want to focus on staying alive. I have been lucky enough to find solid unique gloves, giving me +3 rank to all core skills. Also, the aspect damaging a vulnerable enemy with your basic attack or twisting blades has a 26% chance to summon a Shadow Clone that mimics your attacks. For my pants, the stats are okay. I mostly like the +3 ranks to the Poison Trap skill. For the defensive aspect, damaging elite enemy grants you a barrier absorbing up to 3,455 damage for 10 seconds. Being able to survive is key, so dashing into an elite monster and getting that barrier is a key part of my focus during combat. For my boots, I have another unique item, and this one is extremely good, leaving behind a Trail of Frost that chills enemies. You now deal 10% increased damage to chilled enemies. This will also count towards crowd control, which is a massive bonus. For my bow, I imprinted the Edge Master's aspect. Because this is a two-handed weapon, it's going to provide for a 100% increased bonus to the aspect. Skills deal up to 38% increased damage based on your available primary resource, and gaining the max benefit while you're a full. This is extremely good while your specialization is active. The reason I chose this aspect to be on my bow and not the BladeDancer is to give all my skills the damage increase instead of just the twisting blades. For my weapons, I use swords as they work best with the weapon mastery passive within the skill tree. My first sword's aspect is Unstable Imbuements. When casting Imbuement skill, you trigger an imbued explosion around yourself, applying the effect and dealing 1,093 damage with the same type. When your poison imbuement doesn't have a cooldown, this allows for some decent additional damage. For the next sword, I have the aspect of Bursting Venoms. Critical Strike with Poison Imbued skills have a 10% chance to create a toxic pool that deals 3,731 damage over 3 seconds. While standing in the pool of poison, your poison imbuement has no cooldown and no charge limit. This aspect is extremely strong and synergizes extremely well with the rogue specialization, including your twisting blades. For my amulet, I have the BladeDancer Aspect, which is another core aspect to this build, as it provides for a lot more DPS and AoE damage output. My first rings aspect, dealing direct damage to an enemy affected by your trap skills, has up to 46% chance to make them vulnerable for 3 seconds, which will give you 20% increased damage to those enemies. For the next ring, I got a unique. If a core skill hits 5 or more enemies, 40% of the resource cost is refunded, and since twisting blades is our main core skill, having that resource cost refunded is extremely important, especially when dealing damage to the large group of enemies. The main stats you want to look out for are dexterity, intelligence, and ranks into any skills you are currently using. Any increase in percent damage to poison, close damage, crit chance, crit damage, core skill damage, trap damage, and ultimate damage that can be extremely useful within this build, so make sure to look out for those. Once I have reached max level and I have had the opportunity to fully engage with the Paragon system, I will make an updated video of this build with my fully new gear and any changes I have made, as well as deep diving into the Paragon system. Thank you for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one.